Hey everyone, and welcome to our panel on whistleblower trauma and damages. My name is Richard Condit. I'm co-chair of the whistleblower rights practice at Mehri and Skalet. We have a terrific panel today to discuss this topic with you, and we're going to focus on what types of retaliation tactics employers often implement, how those tactics may become toxic and damaging to whistleblowers, causing trauma, what methods we may use to better assess damages associated with those traumas and those tactics. And finally, how we as lawyers might be more compassionate in working with traumatized clients and whistleblowers. But before we get into the substance, let me ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction. Let me start with you, Jackie.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. I'm happy to be part of Taxpayers Against Fraud's program today because I think it's so important to have the voices of the whistleblowers themselves and people who are trying to be advocates in the space have voice. I became a whistleblower in 2014 while at the Pentagon. I've had a previous history of working with combat veterans and combat trauma. I'm a social worker by background. I was an Army officer myself. So most of my career has been focused on the mental health issues of veterans. But when I became a whistleblower, I saw a lot of the similarities between whistleblowers and my combat veterans. And I've spent decades at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Defense, with the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and then got to the Pentagon. And I believe that that's where my new life and career path began.
Thanks, Jackie. Let me turn to our whistleblower representative on the panel, Eric. Eric, you want to say a little about yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And to echo Jackie's sentiment, I'm too happy to be here to talk with the forum about my experiences and some of the things that I've gone through. My background, I'm an HR professional. I have 30 plus years of experience in various industries. I became a whistleblower in 2017. Working as the HR leader for a small community hospital in Southeast DC, where I experienced a number of different instances that pushed me to the point of standing up and making a call. So I look forward to sharing my experience with everyone today and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Eric. Mehri.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Mehri Inman. I'm a partner at Constantine Cannon. I head our international whistleblower practice, spending time in our London and now some more time in our San Francisco office. I believe Cleve tapped me to come here because I actually lost a client, and that story was featured in a New Yorker article called "The Personal Toll of Whistleblowing." I've learned a lot through that process, and I'm hoping to be able to share some of the experiences and lessons learned from that experience.
And Mehri, I'm glad you referenced that article. Let me tell folks who are listening in that we have a list of references which include that article and other helpful information that you might find useful. So check that out when you get a chance. Well, let's start, folks, with with retaliation tactics. Jackie, what are some retaliation tactics that you're familiar with, and how might we define them?
So I think that's a great place to start because understanding what is retaliation, I think, has been a challenge in this community for a long time. So I created a whistleblower retaliation checklist and found that there are 9 domains of retaliation: gaslighting, mobbing, marginalizing, shunning, devaluing, double binding, blackballing, or blacklisting, or what we now call blocking, counter-accusing, and bullying. These can be a range of things from microaggressions to outright termination. These tactics are systematic and targeting of an employee who is reported or has perceived to caution against wrongdoing. And these employees are then intimidated, blamed, detailed, belittled, and ignored, among a host of other things we call psychological warfare.
Eric, without needing to get into the technical definitions that Jackie might have referenced a minute ago, what kinds of things did you experience in the retaliation you suffered your situation?
Well, I can say I experienced all of them. I mean, if Jackie, it's like she was there with me, reading off the list as they go. And I found that they start off small, as she said, microaggressions, and they escalate. And I ultimately experienced termination. As the HR leader for the hospital, I found that I put a lot of time into developing relationships and fostering trust. And through that, I was privy to a lot of information from all levels of the organization. And it was in that instance that I was made aware of some improprieties that were going on that were actually causing deaths. And there are people that were trying to cover those up. And my role in that was to preserve the information, make sure that we preserve the integrity of the information, and the information was shared and known by all. And in return for that, it began with the the microaggressions and the bullying and the marginalizing, and so on and so forth, and ultimately ended in termination.
You given any notice of your termination, Eric?
No, the only thing it was kind of a situation where I walked into a room and they informed me that my services are no longer needed. The irony of that is that in my role as the HR leader, that is a key role in the hospital organization under Joint Commission standards and also under the Department of Health.
Thanks, Eric. Mehri, can you add any retaliation tactics that some of your clients have seen and fill out the picture a little more?
Sure. I think for a lot of us in TAF, it's a regular occurrence for our clients to have terrific, ongoing, great performance reviews annually. And then all of a sudden, as soon as they speak up, there's something like that expense report you didn't get in, or you were chronically late over your whole career, but only now it matters. So I think that's been interesting. And of course, I'm not an employment lawyer, but the proximate relationship in time to that is very telling of why that's obviously a pretextual reason. I would say that what's interesting is that we've seen the ripple effects of the whistleblower's retaliation extending beyond the whistleblower, him or herself or their self, but going into also their family. I've had one client whose brother worked at the organization that he worked as a contractor at the organization where he was exposing Medicare fraud. And you can imagine that that was one of the first persons that the company sought out to target. So I think people need to take a more expansive view of the ripple effects on who might be targeted.
Great, thank you. So Jackie, I've become recently aware of the concept of moral injury, which I'm learning more and more about as I researched it further. Can you tell us about that and what that is, and how does that impact whistleblowers?
Sure. So moral injury is actually an ancient concept that dates back to early Greece and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I know those are long, complicated stories, but the goal or the point of those stories was the exploration of morality, character, and courage under fire that led Dr. Jonathan Shea, a VA psychiatrist, to compare Homer's epics to his work with Vietnam combat veterans. And out of that has grown sort of this field of study looking at how war and other traumatic events can disrupt identity, undo character, shadow worldviews and beliefs. And we feel like there's an overlap there, and we've started to see more and more research that connects some of these factors to whistleblowers who have suffered retaliation and are psychosocially injured by it.
Eric or Mehri, any perspectives you want to offer on moral injury?
Do you want to go?
I'll let you go, Eric.
Okay. Well, one thing I will say about the moral injury is that it's long lasting. It's like you don't get over it, but you get used to dealing with it, and it's a long-term effect. You know, for me personally, I've gone to the point of hiding my identity. So, for example, in my LinkedIn, I don't have my current employer on my LinkedIn application because I'm not sure what tactics or maneuvers those that were against me will take. If you look at my Facebook or my Instagram or my Twitter, they're all under nom de plumes where there's no connectivity to me. So it's again, not getting over it, but getting used to it, and it's a long-term effect.
Yes,
Richard, I would say I would just add that I think the psychology of a whistleblower is interesting, and it impacts the moral injury question, which is that most of my clients over 24 years, they expect when they expose the problem, they don't even, lots of them are just doing their job. They don't even consider it a whistleblower moment, and they expect to be embraced for what they're doing. So that is sort of that's an expectation that is very difficult for them to get over, is that they expect they're doing the right thing.
Right.
And there's some great nomenclature in terms of saying, are we speaking up against the organization, or are we speaking up for the organization? We are speaking up for the organization, and that's what the whistleblower feels, yet that's not how they're received. So that's sort of the psychological dimension I see of clients, that is hard to not be embraced, but to instead be kicked in the teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and if I can add to what Eric said earlier, it's that shattering of trust and the betrayal, more so than the physicality of war. And I think that was some of the work of Jonathan Shea. He wrote the book Achilles in Vietnam, and to make that point, that it wasn't just the horrors of war that caused a moral injury. It was really more about the internal conflicts of believing the world to be one way, and then through experience, betrayal, loss of faith and trust, that becomes a different kind of injury that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But it's that it's the injury to our psyche that becomes so important.
Well, that's a great segue, Jackie, into the next phase of our discussion, which is about how is it that these retaliation tactics become toxic to the point where they have such an impact on our clients, and in many cases, as Eric is reflecting, a long-lasting impact.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's where this idea of retaliation and these tactics that can become moral injury can also relate to or cause post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which we're very familiar with combat veterans and other types of trauma. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicide. Those conditions are also factors that relate then to divorce, poverty, unemployment, homelessness, and other comorbid health conditions that are stress related, like autoimmune disorders. So we can see where these tactics and the toxicity of them are not just emotional, but they're also very physical and can have those greater impacts.
What can you say about the long-lasting nature of some of them? Are there particular tactics that have a longer term impact than others? Help us out a little bit with that aspect.
Sure. So things like PTSD and depression, I mean, those become lifelong conditions. They require medication, they require treatment. They change so much of your fundamentally who you are, and there's lots of study that shows that there is changes in brain chemistry because of the dopamine and the adrenaline that stress in the body causes, that these become permanent changes to the person, to the personality, that that can change the trajectory of their lives. And that's what I've seen with whistleblowers. The ruminating, the stress, the hypervigilant behavior. For many, it's very hard to close that chapter of the book of their life and move on to another chapter. They get stuck in the depression and the ruminating, that it makes it almost impossible to move on. So when we talk about trauma and a trauma-informed perspective, we have to understand that traumatized people, victims, can become and take on that persona, even though they move into a survivorship mode. There's still constant triggers of the physical world around them, the being in open spaces around strangers that they don't know, the cyberbullying has made the world a much more scarier place. And we haven't really talked about cyberbullying, doxing, spoofing, spamming. All of those are things that can happen outside of the workplace that can put somebody on higher alert, and again, add to that stress and that lifelong hypervigilant behavior.
Eric, without, getting too personal or asking you to relive much of this, are there particular tactics that you experience that seem to have a longer effect on you than others, perhaps?
Absolutely. I think about marginalizing, where they put me in a situation where they took away a good bit of my role and my responsibility. And as such, it starts to undermine your credibility, undermine your confidence, undermine your professionalism. And it took a lot to regain that and to rebuild. Fortunately, I'm married to a really strong individual that was able to pour confidence back into me, that was able to help build me up when I was down, so that the effects weren't as long lasting as they could have been absent her presence and her inputs. So yes, the marginalizing, the bullying, where I'm now looking at, or when I walk into the organization, it's okay, who's for me, who's against me, who's on what side, and it's always looking at us or them, and so I'm aware of that, but it still does not diminish the presence of that thought.
Mary, have you, in your experience, have your clients seemed to have issues with long-term effects of the retaliation they've experienced?
Yes, the client that was featured in the New Yorker, I think he would say that he tried to get past the whistleblowing moment, and he was not allowed to, because every time he tried to get another job in the southern or central part of Florida, he was denied, and he had no option to move because his daughter was living there and he had joint custody. So sometimes you want to move on and you're not really allowed to. Every time he got the job offer, when it got to the reference point of that perspective, and he just wasn't, then any offer would be withdrawn. Of course, we have employment counsel who ably, and Debbie Katz ably represented him to say that, because obviously there is a claim for subsequent employers to retaliate. So I would say that's one thing. I also think that it's really important to recognize, and this is something I'm newly coming to, and as a result of my relationship with Jackie Garrick, is that when your whistleblowers speak to the press or speak to the government, it can be a triggering event for them. And I don't think I appreciated that. A lot of our clients have to retell their story again and again. And I'm looking at Eric and Jackie because they're retelling it for us right now. And I think I've understood now and gained a better appreciation for the fact that even though you think, hey, we just filed a complaint in your name, or hey, this is great, you're going to talk to the government and you'll be vindicated and corroborated, that there's still baggage with that and that you need to be sensitive to it.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think as lawyers, we often feel like, when we do the great complaint or we help prepare someone for a terrific interview with the government or whatever other steps there might be in the case, that, we're really doing a terrific service to the client, and, we're moving the case along, and it's going to be successful. I think what we don't stop and think about enough, or at least not until recently, for me at least, is, what is the impact on our client in reliving and going through this experience, and shouldn't we ask them, we're about to do X. How do you feel about that? What do you need to help us support you? Well, so yeah, let's talk a little bit more about impacts. And Jackie, you mentioned at the top of the discussion, the checklist that you and some colleagues have come up with. Can you talk us through that a little bit? Tell us how that works.
Sure. So for short, I call it the work, the whistleblower retaliation checklist. And I developed that because I felt like we need a common lexicon and a taxonomy that can identify the impacts of retaliation toxic tactics. So for example, when we talk about gaslighting, which can lead to ruminating, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, those are symptoms of PTSD. A clinician might recognize those and understand those, but to understand them as they apply to the workplace and a workplace traumatic stress, we need the tools that can match those traumatic stress symptoms to a diagnostic criteria. And there are other standardized psychological tools that you may be familiar with, such as the MMPI, the Beck Depression Inventory, the Columbia Suicide Severity Scale. These tools help categorize and explain symptomatology for treatment providers to intervene. The courts can hear these diagnoses as well. But when it comes to mental health issues, there already is a lack of parity to other workplace injuries. And there are guides to evaluation of permanent impairment, as you may know, but if you lose an arm in a chipper, let's say, it's easier for a judge or a jury to understand the lifelong damages. But when the harm is emotional and caused by a hostile work environment, then it becomes a little bit more nebulous and subjective to make that kind of decision or to understand that. So I wanted to create the whistleblower retaliation checklist to take away that subjectivity, to reduce the mystery and explain to the courts just how damaging retaliation, discrimination, and harassment can be to the person who has experienced it, and how it can actually disrupt the trajectory of that employee's life and the life of their family.
And with respect to the checklist, do you come up with some kind of ultimate assessment through the checklist, or what does the checklist provide a client or a practitioner, an attorney, in terms of evaluating the client's situation?
So when we use the checklist, the idea is to, and like I said, it's got 9 domains and about 75 indicators. We can develop a scoring mechanism then for the severity of the retaliation. And then I can draw the conclusions about whether or not somebody has, or they endorse the symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety. If they're suicidal, we can then take that information and write up a report, a psychosocial assessment. I'm a social worker, so that's what we do as how we present a case is through the psychosocial. So we can even look at understanding the background, the childhood, what makes somebody have the propensity to even be a whistleblower and want to bring forward these issues. Why was what they discussed so important to them? And then how was their perspective shattered by the retaliation? And we put all of that into a report. And I think it starts to paint a bigger picture for a judge, for a jury, to understand the motivation and the complete picture of who this person was, so that they become more understandable and relatable, and that their level of injury and the damages that's been done to them is viewable. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure it does. But are there studies or literature that support this approach?
Yes. So in fact, I'm working on a book right now for Springer Publishing Company with Dr. Martina Bach. The book is going to be called The Psychosocial Impacts of Whistleblower Retaliation, Shattering Employee Resilience and the Workplace Promise. We've been researching the literature with the hope that we can organize it in such a way to validate the work as an instrument and demonstrate the need for clinicians, attorneys, judges, juries to better understand this level of injury. And I think you provided a great bibliography reference list for this session that has a lot of that work documented in it.
Mehri, are there particular studies or literature that you are familiar with that you'd like to talk about a little bit?
Yeah, I do. And I just wanted to answer a question in the chat, which is that Jackie's terrific retaliation checklist is actually part of our submission, our material. So you'll find it on the conference site. One of my strategies of helping prepare a whistleblower for the decision, if they're in that posture that they actually get to choose whether they're going to blow the whistle or not, is to help them and their family look at some of the empirical data on this point. I think a lot of us in the room are very familiar with the 2010 study on pharmaceutical pharmaceutical whistleblowers from the New England Journal of Medicine saying there are higher incidences of divorce, mental health problems, alcohol and drug abuse. But I wanted to point to, and those are important things to set the stage and set the expectations for your clients on what could happen. But there's some recent research that I really would love to call people's attention to. One that sort of blew my mind. In 2008, a professor at Georgetown Business School, Marcia Maselli, researched the impact of retaliation on women whistleblowers, and basically saying that women experience more retaliation than men. And that, interestingly, the level of power they hold within the organization does not change the result, which I think is fascinating. Whereas for men, the higher up you are, the more you can be insulated from it. So I think that's important to recognize. A lot of us have female clients, obviously. Just this year, Professor Kate Kenny, a business school professor at the National University of Ireland in Galway, she did a study with Professor Mariana Fataki. They sampled 60 whistleblowers from the UK, the US, Australia, and they said that the whistleblowers that they surveyed lost 60% of their pre-disclosure earnings. So they looked at pre and post whistleblowing, 60% reduction. They spent 1,500 hours on their retaliation and other whistleblowing claims, which basically becomes something we haven't said here yet, but Eric and Jackie can say, is being a whistleblower becomes a second job on top of your other job if you're lucky enough to be reemployed. And that 64% of them suffered formal detriment. And because we're dealing in pounds, this is a study from the UK, the average reduction in income was 480,000 pounds. So I think those sorts of things help so that whistleblowers know that they're not alone, and that the data shows that this is something that they can expect. Of course, we cannot have this whole panel go without saying that there are whistleblowers who have positive experiences, and we can talk about that. I don't think Professor Fataki's study does look at people who actually had a positive effect and that actually buoyed their confidence in other things, but they're certainly in the minority.
Well, Eric, let's transition to you a bit here. And do you want to comment a bit on Mehri's observation about whistleblowing becoming a second job, and then I want to ask you about coming through it all. But let's start with the second job part of it.
Absolutely. I was, there was a portion of paralysis during that time where I was insulated in my office. I would isolate myself in my office, and that was pretty much all I would think about. There was not a lot of productivity that happened during that time. I recall, spending long hours in the office, but not a lot getting done. So it was my thought that if I get there and people see me there, then maybe this will kind of dissipate and go away. But my focus and my productivity were pretty much gone. So it was just an existence at that time, and a lot of work went into just maintaining.
Well, you did a great job in getting through, and so I'd like to have you share a little bit about what I'll call the resilience aspect of this, and I'll share with folks that Eric has come through his whistleblowing experience. He has continued in his career very successfully. But tell folks, as much as you feel like sharing, Eric, what techniques you use or what you did to try to come out the other side, and what might other folks be able to utilize to either advise their clients, or if they're whistleblowers themselves, do in order to help themselves get through the other side, so to speak.
Well, one thing I did was I focused on the fact that this, through my faith, I strongly believe this too shall pass. So my thought was, what will I be doing after this? How will I start to rebuild? So it's focusing on the future, not just the here and now and what I was going through, but help myself to take myself out of that moment in time and think about what's going to happen in the future. The fact that I also realized that I'm not going to necessarily be at 100% or jumping out there into a level of job that I had. So I made the determination that it's a rebuilding process, and knowing that I'm going into a rebuilding process, it's just a matter of time on how long it takes me to get back to a point where I was. as a result, I ended up taking after I left that organization, I ended up taking a job with a company. In reality, I probably would have never looked at this opportunity, but it was broad enough to give me a bright, a positive perspective, allow me to enhance and rebuild my skills. And during that time period, I also looked at what can I do to enhance my skills. So I became professionally certified within my discipline. I initiated a number of different projects, and it allowed me the opportunity to, I guess, regain my confidence and build again. And as a result, there was an opportunity that presented itself with a phenomenal HR leader and someone I had been wanting to work with for quite some time. And the opportunity presented itself. I was able to connect with that individual, and the rest is history. Now I'm working with them, and back to where I was before I left the first hospital.
Well, that's a terrific story, and we're very glad that you came through it, as so many folks struggle with coming through it. Would there be any particular advice from a kind of an HR perspective? You're somebody that looks at job applicants, has to evaluate people. What would you tell a whistleblower about, trying to come out the other side, trying to be more positive, get through it, get to the next level?
Yeah, exactly that. What are your goals? It's always important to think about goal setting, and and to create a list of things that you look to accomplish within that time period. Again, back to focusing on the future and focusing on enhancing your skills, and also understanding this is a rebuilding process. So it's a matter of looking for that opportunity that will afford you the benefit to build and to develop your skills and to get back to where you were, because it is a devastating event. It is crippling, it is paralyzing. And so it's important to recognize that, and also important to recognize that it's going to take some time to get back into shape. I'm someone that works out quite a lot, and a recent injury, whenever you're injured, you know that you're not going to be able to go back into that same fitness program that you had before. It's going to take some time for you to develop and get back to the level of fitness where you were. And so it's important to just focus on that.
Okay. So Jackie, your group, Whistleblowers of America, is doing some great work with peer support for whistleblowers. Can you share what some of the benefits are for whistleblowers and peer support?
Yeah, so and first I have to applaud what Eric just said. I'm sitting here just kind of cheering him on, because I know how hard that walk is. And being resilient and maintaining that is one of the reasons I created Whistleblowers of America. It was completely by accident. I wasn't thinking I was creating a new pathway. I was really looking for other people to talk to who understood, what is this whistleblowing? I mean, the first time somebody called me a whistleblower, I was like, no, that's not what I did. I just reported fraud. I didn't report, I wasn't a whistleblower. Like, it took me a long time to even wrap my brain around that what I did was whistleblowing. And then one day I was through LinkedIn, I had connected with another female veteran who was working in law enforcement. And we talked for about an hour. And as we were getting off the phone, she said to me, I've been sitting here with my gun on my table. And it just crashed down on me that everything I've ever known about trauma and suicide was what we needed for whistleblowers. And peer support is an evidence-based intervention used in multiple settings. The basic concept is to empower people with similar life experiences to help each other cope and remain resilient, just like what Eric was saying. So we've seen it, veterans helping veterans, cop to cop, cancer patients. And for us, it's whistleblowers pairing with other whistleblowers in our network to connect for mutual support. It's about decision-making, problem solving, venting, and feeling validated in an arena where you don't normally have that. Eric's lucky that he's had a wife that he could share his story with. As some lawyers know, once this is a case is under sale, you can't even talk to your family about this. So it's a very lonely walk. And when the time's right, you really need to find the right person who can understand what you've been through and talk about what you've gone through with that person. So sometimes it could be as informal as like an AA meeting, which many people are familiar with, or as prescribed as when the Department of Veterans Affairs hires peer counselors. Peers can answer hotlines, and they can, and the idea is that the support though is reciprocal, that both parties get something out of it. So at WOA, we've incorporated a trauma-informed perspective and suicide prevention into what we do. And we've developed a whistleblower protection advocate certification program to professionalize employee support when they are coping with a hostile work environment and workplace traumatic stress. So, I mean, that's kind of our goal and our hope for the future, is that wherever you look, you'll find a whistleblower protection advocate who can engage in this peer support and supplement things that law firms and counseling centers can offer to people who are whistleblowers.
Are there, Jackie, are there circumstances under which you would recommend that a whistleblower seek, aside from peer support, maybe professional assistance or counseling or therapy?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, those are all mental health conditions that are the specialty of some trauma counselors, and that the right counseling can help somebody really truly cope through some of the more severe episodes of depression and suicidal ideology. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, there are medications, there's mindful meditation practices. So there are lots of tools in that toolkit that a whistleblower should really be encouraged to take advantage of. But I understand there's a lot of concern around that, because in the past, some of these diagnoses have been weaponized and used against the whistleblower when they've gone into court and they're labeled as crazy, unreliable, their judgment is impaired. I mean, that's all part of the gaslighting, is then if you do the right thing to get help for yourself, that can be used against a person. And I think that's where attorneys need to be able to show no that this person was victimized by their employer, and that's why they have these conditions, and really fight for, yes, they have a mental health condition, you caused it. And trust me, I get that. It was probably one of the most cathartic moments for me was when I got to tell the judge and read to the judge these emails I had gotten on discovery that I didn't get during, that I got on FOIA that I didn't get during discovery. And just having that cathartic moment was important. And so I think knowing and being able to set those goals with a therapist is really helpful, because managing those expectations, going back to some of the things Eric was talking about earlier, is, I think, an important part of the healing process.
Those are terrific points that kind of lead us into the next part of our discussion on confidentiality. So peer support, getting counseling, you know, being in therapy, all that sort of thing creates potential evidence. Mehri, are there concerns that practitioners should be aware of with respect to that type of information?
Yeah, so there is a federal common law patient psychotherapist privilege, and many states have an equivalent. And I'm happy to say that psychotherapist is defined to not include not only licensed psychiatrists and psychologists, but also licensed social workers like Jackie. So those conversations can be maintained as a privilege. It gets a little tougher when you get to peer support. So a lot of the way I think about it is very practically, which is, do I have the kind of client who it's their credibility is the sole basis on which the government's going to rely for its case? There's very few cases that are like that. If that is the case, then I'd be much more circumspect about having them in a peer support group and thinking about what might come out there, or I would work closely with them. But for the most part, most of our whistleblowers are reporting things that are corroborated by documents, by other witnesses. And so I don't want to undermine their healing process by being too strict on allowing them to be in therapy. I just give them some guides on how best to do that. Most group therapy, as Jackie can say, is obviously confidential. And so as long as they're not taking notes and things, I don't think, obviously those people could be put on the stand. But I think that, again, as long as your whistleblower they aren't the center of the case, I think it's less of an issue for you. But I wish there were support group privileges that expanded and extended, but I haven't found them.
And of course, the situation might be a little different in the employment side of the case, particularly if the person raises damages associated with pain and suffering, emotional distress. And we've cited in our reference list some, a sampling of cases that talk about when confidentiality is protected and when it's not, or when it's waived, depending on, issues being raised. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Jackie, is there anything in particular that your group does in the peer support realm to try to protect the confidentiality of folks that come to you?
Yeah, so we have a Whistleblowers of America Code of Ethics. We talk about confidentiality and maintaining the privacy of individuals. So far, nobody's ever asked me to break any kind of confidentiality. And we've been really good about, like, when we even connect peers, we share that this is a confidential arrangement. We share the code of ethics so that they understand what the skill set is that we're looking for, how to establish boundaries and to know what you can and can't share. I think everybody's been very respectful in that way. And I think when we connect people, again, I mean, we're not a clinical setting. So, we don't take notes, we don't have case records. So it's not that type of a program. And I think that helps us with maintaining confidentiality.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit now about how lawyers could be a bit more compassionate or mindful and aware of what their clients might be experiencing. Jackie, what do you think lawyers should be aware of, and how should they kind of assist their clients in dealing with the let me say trauma associated with, going through a case and reliving what they've experienced? So I have found it interesting in that as a social worker in this world, I'm one of the few that I've met. Most everybody else are attorneys that deal with these kinds of cases. And I think that the use of the psychosocial, the use of the trauma-informed perspective, understanding what is PTSD and the symptomatology of PTSD, understanding suicide prevention. I'm going to do my 2-second commercial here, because I always tell people, get out your phones and type in the National Lifeline number, the 1-800-273-8255. Know that that's a resource, that if you feel like you have a client who's really emotionally struggling, it's not in your bailiwick to deal with those issues, then get on the phone with the crisis line and connect them with somebody who can really help. Make sure you know some of the therapeutic resources in your area, and who can really be called upon to help them. Do you have a whistleblower protection advocate in your office? Is there somebody willing to go through the training that we offer about sensitivity to this, and to know what some of the mindfulness tools are, and to know when to make those referrals? Because listening to your client go through suicidal ideation, that's not what you necessarily need or want to be doing, but it should be something you're mindful of and be able to refer them and get them the right help, because you don't want to lose your client in the middle of your case. And Mehri, what would your recommendations be for working with traumatized whistleblowers?
So I'm happy to give my thoughts, and also happy that we've got a wealth of people on the call. It'd be interesting to hear what I tick off, and if there are other approaches, it'd be really nice to hear. But my sense is, one of the things with the Me Too movement and understanding what gaslighting is, I now understand the importance for so many of our clients, the first conversation. Because the first conversation may be the first time that they are actually finally vindicated. They've been gaslit, they've been marginalized, they're treated as radioactive. And so I think as lawyers, you're ready to quickly go to the analysis. And I think I've certainly learned to take my time and pause and say, you didn't drink, they all drank the Kool-Aid, they've drank the Kool-Aid, you didn't. And what you're seeing is corroborated, and this is real. I have a client at the moment who continues to call me because he keeps expecting that the documents he gave us, he thinks that it's going to show up like it's not really true because he can't believe it. And in fact, what we're seeing is that the documents are, for the first time ever, even better than what he said they were going to be. So there's handholding that's required. We're not qualified, but you need to have a bedside manner in a way the doctor has a bedside manner. And the more informed you are about the practices, the more empathetic you can be. I think I learned the hard way that I tried to take on too much of the role of handholding. I certainly referred my client out for substance abuse and other counseling issues. But I think this comes at a risk, right? They come to depend on you. Fortunately, in cases like Eric's, there is a spousal privilege. So in cases where people are married, they have the ability to safely speak to their partners. And so very early on, even at the decision-making phase, once we've decided that we think this is a viable case that we would want to proceed with and that we would recommend they could proceed, we enlist the family. We say, have you spoken to your spouse about this? What is the impact on you and your family members? And I've said, I would be happy to speak to your spouse. And I've done that on a number of occasions. And I share the readings and basically take a lot of time to just basically dissuade them. I always say, there's a time where I say, here we go. I think you have a great case. Now let me take my lawyer hat off and tell you why you shouldn't bring it. Let me tell you about all the things that could happen. I want you to make this decision in a fully informed way, and I want your family to be involved to the extent possible, family, friends. So those are sort of a few of the lessons that I've learned. But one thing that had occurred to me is that I don't think we're doing as good a job as we could for some of our uber successful whistleblowers. So in terms of managing expectations, there's some really terrible studies on lottery winners. And a lot of our whistleblowers, if you're going to get a $100 million award, doesn't necessarily bring happiness, actually brings suicide and other problems. So I think it's not just at the front end of the funnel, it's at the end. When you think you've achieved an amazing result, that can also backfire. So I hate to give that bad news, but I think we're better prepared, in addition to giving them tax planning advice, to also talk about what that could mean.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eric, not to put you on the spot on behalf of all whistleblowers, but in terms of what you're hearing from Mehri and Jackie on how we should approach working with whistleblowers, what are your thoughts? What would you validate out of what you've heard?
As I'm listening to them and I'm recalling, I mean, they're spot on. The fact of the empathy, the fact of the real world perspective. One thing that I appreciated about working with my attorney is that they kept me grounded on real world perspective and what to expect out of this and what kept me realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting here listening to them and I'm thinking to myself, yes, and that's exactly and I'm thinking that I wish I would have known Jackie back then, so I could have had access to some of these resources that I think are a phenomenal asset.
Jackie, we have a little time, so can you tell folks a little bit more about the certification program that you described and what's entailed in that?
Yeah, so we created a whistleblower retaliation checklist because I'm giving a cue to say, yes, I'm still watching. I don't want to get cut off.
Yeah, Jackie, I'm sorry.
So
Everyone can answer the CLE question. That'd be great. Sorry, go ahead, Jackie, about your certification.
Yeah, so we created this. So for the peer support piece, we've created a minimum of this 10 hours of training that helps people understand, what is whistleblowing, and what are the peer support skills that we need, what are the tools, and then, what is right doing. We've included this idea about a workplace promise that we want to help build healthy workplaces in the future. So for folks like Eric who have returned to the job market, or they become self-employed and now they're going to be the boss over other people. How do you build out this right-doing environment? So we've created these 10 hours of training. We've created what we call the Giraffe Award. I got my little buddy over my shoulder here. We talk about embracing your inner giraffe because giraffes stand tall, they stick their necks out in the face of criticism, and they travel in a tower. So we have to be those that tower above and rise above some of these things, and having that network and having that community, and again, professionalizing all of that, I think is really important, because I think that just like we've seen ombudsmen go to court with crime victims, somebody needs to be able to walk this process through with whistleblowers and recognize just how traumatizing this is and help them heal. So that's why we created the certification program, because we really wanted to embrace the professional need, and that this is a full-time job. I was never expecting that this is what I would be doing for a living at this point in my life, but it's where we've turned, and I'm so proud of so many of the people I meet, and just the what it takes to put your life back together. Because winning, I won my case, but it was as I said, it was the conversation with the judge that was more cathartic than actually getting the letter saying, hey, you're going to get all your back pay and all your benefits back. That was nice. But it was really just knowing or finding those cathartic moments and being able to move forward with those things. And for me right now, it's seeing other people who grow, survive this process, knowing that we're preventing suicide, we're preventing homelessness, we're preventing drug abuse, that there's a career path in this for so many more people.
And we've done, panelists, you've done terrific on our time. So we do have a little time for questions. If people have questions they'd like to share with us at this point, we can certainly address them.
Richard, we do have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
We have one from Pat Alman Road, and they're asking about thoughts on helping a relator who's suffered retaliation. How can you help them be patient during the sealed period of the case? They really want to go to the press. How do you any other ideas for trying to get them to behave and not go to the press? Other than the usual, of course, he was saying, of course, you're going to diminish your award. The only thing I can do that I would do in addition is, obviously, if you can find a way and it's the appropriate kind of whistleblower for them to have other whistleblowers to talk to, that can help with the patient. That is that peer support piece of it. I would also caution people that the media is seen as this silver bullet. And I'm pleased to say that we now have some really great journalists. And for instance, Blueprint for Free Speech has a guide called the Perugia Principles on how to deal responsibly with whistleblowers. But I would be very cautious in who you have your whistleblowers talk to. And basically set their expectations that they need to be cautious. All of that said, I've had clients go to the press despite this. so I'm mostly successful, but not always. And I do think they will have less of a need to do that if they have the appropriate supports of the therapist, the social worker, a peer support group.
So what I tell people is to have your plan for the press. And that can take time, is doing the press releases, the packaging, knowing your elevator speech, knowing, is this a 500-word story or 4,000-word story, and finding the right reporter. So there's a lot of work that goes into going to the press, because I've had great experiences with reporters. I've had really bad experiences with reporters, and I've had media training from the Pentagon. So working with the press is not as a silver bullet as people think. It can take a lot of work.
I guess I would just add in response to that question that, I've certainly had clients that wanted to go to the press, wanted to talk to anyone who would listen, actually, about the issue, and especially if they felt it was particularly important, and oftentimes it is, whether it's fiscal fraud, or it's something to do with possible public health injury or other things. Oftentimes our clients have important things to to say, and that there are matters that are really of public concern. I try to embrace the, lawyer as counselor element of our profession, and take off the hat, as Jackie said a little while ago, and put aside the analyst piece and the straight on lawyering piece, and say, let's just talk person to person about going through this and what the experience would be like if you go to the press, if it happens at this time versus another time. Not just what it means for your case, what does it mean for you personally? Because of course, becoming public earlier means exposure earlier, and all exposure is not good. The old adage about negative press is better than no press is not true for whistleblowers. It's really important that your press moments, if you have them, are as carefully choreographed as they can be in a free press scenario. So I would say also do your best, even though it takes time, to talk them through this and to talk to them person to person, and not just as their lawyer, in terms of trying to discuss all the different aspects and outcomes that could occur.
Richard, I would add that, and I'd love to get Jackie's thoughts on this, that I've come to appreciate that when whistleblowers are often making their decision, if they're lucky enough to get to choose to be a whistleblower, they're often in a sense of exigency, right? They're fully in the trauma. And that's not necessarily the best place to be to make good decisions. And so I often point that out to them without at all being patronizing, but just saying, look, this stings. You were just fired you were walked out the door that day and told to pack your box. That sucks. And that is really painful. And the normal human response is to lash out and go to the media. So let's honor that feeling and understand where it's coming from, but realize it may not serve you as well. So maybe we need to make these decisions a little bit later. As to the press, let's revisit that.
No, I definitely agree. That's what I say. And a way to cope with that wanting to tell the story need is, yeah, let's work on a plan for that. So we might not want to go to the press immediately, but 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, as the case has morphed, that's where I tell people, journal, write your own notes, write your own op-eds. Don't print them, but review them. And I've written lots of stuff. It's never the first draft that gets into print. So it's being able to really work on that, and then being able to be prepared, because I think we forget about once things are in the public domain, there's all kinds of people commenting and chattering and twitting and posting and all that stuff that can be scary. I've had whistleblowers who have been threatened. Their families have been threatened. Your phone starts to ring. People are posting things about you that you don't even know. They're threatening bodily harm. They're calling for you to be attacked, name called. It can get ugly in the press. And I've had, some of my experiences too, where, people will really use the press to go after the whistleblower. So as soon as you put your story out there and you think, ta-da, vindicated, well, the opposing party is going to come out with their ta-da moment, and you have to be ready for that.
Well, Eric, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you think about the press issue? Did you have I want to go to the press moment?
Oh, absolutely. But to the point is, I thought about it, and I came to the realization that moving too quickly would not be the best thing. So, fortunately, I've seen it from both sides. I've seen, the people that have gone through it and recognize that they're jumping back into the situation too early and moving too quickly, and it shows. And you may think you're showing, or it's not showing, but it does. And having that realization and having that exposure and experience, helped me to curtail that.
Well, I want to thank our panelists, Jackie, Mehri, Eric, terrific job. And I want to thank TAF for having us put on this panel. It's we view it as a very important element of working with whistleblowers and whistleblower practice. And I know we've got the keynote speaker coming up, so I'll let James switch us over at this point, but thanks, everyone.
Yep, at 2:45, just click the little picture in an event and you'll be sent to the Zoom for Secretary Becerra.
Great.